Good morning, everybody. How's everyone today? How's Malaysia treating you? Amazing Malaysia. Have you actually went for any tours just yet? No? All caught up here? So are you guys fueled by passion and knowledge that you want to pick up from our panel today, this morning? Yes? Excellent. Okay. Today, I would say I am very honored to be in the midst of giants. Okay, we have exchanges, we have people who manage trade accounts in the millions, and then we also have investors, investor VC institutions here. So I'm going to ask some probing questions, and if you have any questions along the way, I would like you to write it down and then pass over to some of my colleagues here, and then I can actually try to answer some of these questions that you might have. Okay, so to maybe start off everything, I would like to maybe ask, Samson to actually start introducing everybody and their nature of business to everybody, so that everybody gets a little bit of background of who you are, what you do, and then we can get going. So basically, today's topic is about STOs. Okay, let me ask one question. Do you know what is STOs? Yeah? Okay, who knows what's STOs? Okay. That's great. Along the way, we'll try to explain a little bit and demystify some of these questions. Okay? Come, maybe Sam, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Sam Lee. I'm the founder and CEO of Constreet. Constreet is an enabler of the future iBank. We do four things. First, we do advisory, so we help token issuer to issue the tokens and be successful. This includes the utility tokens and also the security tokens we're going to be talking about. And then we have an asset management platform in Singapore, so that's the fun part for the investment. We also run investment roadshow. It's more like the pirate investor roadshow for the professional investor. We also develop a back-end issuing and trading system for the security tokens. So this sort of like helping the advisory service as one-stop solution. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Samson. Yeah. So basically, you're the money guy, right?
I'm trying to help people.
Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise? Okay.
Show me the money.
I love the pocket square. Okay.
So, Salamat Pagi. Good morning. My name is Andrew Powell. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with the Gibraltar Stock Exchange. So we're one of 100 or so regulated stock exchanges in the world. So we're small, but we're the same as Bursa Malaysia or the SGX, where we have to work under a regulated framework. So in our case, we work under the local Gibraltar regulator, plus also under the umbrella of Europe, the ESMA regulator. So when we talk about security tokens, to us, essentially it's just shares which are settled on new technology. So we currently are a stock exchange, but what we are looking to do in a couple of months' time is to settle our shares on blockchain technology, so-called distributed ledger technology. So in our case, our stock exchange will be settling shares or digital securities, or in this conference, we're calling them security tokens. But as I said, look, if we just simplify it, we're just talking about shares which are settled on new technology, blockchain technology. In our case, we'll be settling it on a protocol called STAX, which is the Securities Trading Asset Classification Settlement Protocol. So other exchanges are also looking to settle their shares on a very similar system. So, for example, the Swiss exchange is going to start settling shares on DLT technology. The Singapore exchange is setting up a small cap exchange called iStocks to start looking at this as well. Hong Kong is going to put their flow from, say, the rest of the world onto Shanghai, Shenzhen, onto this new technology. So, again, just to demystify things for you, as far as we're concerned, security tokens are just your normal shares or bonds or funds which are just settled on new technology.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
I'm Josh from QCP. We're a proprietary trading company based in Singapore. Provide OTC services. We market make on exchange, off exchange. We trade stablecoins and advise a number of stablecoins very actively. And we also take part in a few equity investments across Southeast Asia, mostly in exchanges and a few token projects. Thanks.
Okay, Josh. So you also have investments. You have an investment arm as well.
Yeah, we take some positions in infrastructure, stuff that helps out with liquidity provisioning, stuff that helps us with building our projects, anything that helps grow the derivatives market in particular.
Okay. When you say you take a position, is buying the stocks after they are listed, or when you go in early as an
tends to be pretty early,
okay.
Pre-seed or seed rounds, where most of these are completely new ideas to begin with. There's very few venture firms that have the technical capability to see the reason for them to exist,
okay.
right? Why would you need a decentralized option settlement platform, for example?
Okay.
We're practitioners, we need it, so we invest in it.
Okay, okay, thank you, Joshua. Yep, that's it.
Okay, good morning. I wear many hats, so I'm actually sitting on the committee for the Singapore FinTech Association. So essentially, we're actually supported by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is the central bank. And you might have heard of us recently in the Singapore budget. So the Minister of Finance actually mentioned the Singapore FinTech Association in the budget speech. So what we do is that we sit between the regulator, the big financial institutions, the established financial institutions, and as well as the startups. So what we do is that we try to create a tripartite collaborative environment for everyone, okay? And that includes access to capital, access to talent, and marketplace, all right? The other hat that I wear is also as the exchange owner. So what we do is that, obviously, as some of the panelists mentioned, I think STO is a big thing. So that's no different for us. We are actually applying for an IRMO license in Singapore. Also happy to announce that we are actually accepted into the sandbox in Hong Kong, one of the 6 so far in batch 1. So hopefully that will bring us to the next step. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Benson. Well, a little bit about myself. I run Crypto Valley Singapore. So effectively, I am a member-based organization. So it's really not for profit, but rather we are a advocacy of blockchain. And why blockchain technology is essentially it's just a platform. But I go into discussions with sector like maritime, or you can go into manufacturing or land or property, how the blockchain technology can actually improve your ROI and your productivity. So that's the space that I'm actually in. But here today, I'm here as an advocate to share why and how blockchain can actually be the 22nd century, future-proofing ourselves. So I'm very glad that you guys are here. So thank you for the introduction, everybody. So maybe we were talking just now about STOs. Okay, so maybe we can do a bit of like fire round, free flow, a little bit more informal. What happened last year, and then what's currently going on, and then how do we see the future from ICOs moving into STOs, or is it going to be complementary? And then how does the regulators come in, you know, and how do you see your projects? Anybody?
Look, others. Maybe I'll just start with just some broad macro themes, if I may. I think just to follow on from yesterday's keynote by Dr. Youssef from MITE, I think one of his 2 key points were financial inclusion and how do we empower Malaysian SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, and how do we look at this in an ASEAN context, so, you know, a regional context. So I think the big macro themes is how can we get capital to small to medium-sized enterprises So, of course, Grab has been a great success, and they were able to get capital from the SoftBank Vision Fund, but not everyone is going to get access to that capital. And if you think with China, with their One Belt, One Road, that's $1 trillion over 10 years, which is going to specific projects which Beijing is going to dictate. So we saw here in Malaysia, the Prime Minister cancelling the ECRL, the East Coast Railway, because it didn't suit Malaysia's, it was probably going to be too onerous for Malaysia. So how do we solve for that problem where China is going to be taking in $1 trillion, President Trump's going to be taking in $1 trillion to rebuild America, so-called Make America Great, which is maybe understandable because of their crumbling infrastructure. So how do we here in Malaysia and the 600 million people in ASEAN raise capital? So what I would suggest is that security tokens or digital shares is a great way for small to medium-sized enterprises, for small property developers. If I'm in Sarawak and I've got a water treatment plant I need to build, how do I raise capital for that? Or I'm in Malacca and I want to, start making Nonya Kueh and start exporting, how do I get, capital for that in Malacca if I'm a small to medium-sized enterprise? And I think the encouraging theme here is that the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, came out with a white paper a few months ago saying that capital raisings via STOs is a valid way for small to medium-sized enterprises to raise capital. But the proviso is that it must be regulated, not draconian regulation, but some simple rules of engagement. So in this sense, I would suggest that Singapore is not a bad role model with their guidelines from the MAS. But I think that's the macro landscape, is how do we get capital into this region, as Dr. Youssef said yesterday? How do we allow small mums and dads and to start investing in good companies? And then how do we get capital to small to medium-sized enterprises in Malaysia to encourage growth here in this part of the world?
So just to follow up on that point, I think it's worth to take a step back. Obviously, all of us have heard what ICOs are. ICOs, some call it TGE, which is Token Generation Event, whatever name you call it. I think at the end of the day, it is a fund-raising event, right? Let's call a spade a spade. So I think gone were the days where you come with a white paper and a fancy website, or sometimes no website, just a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, so on and so forth. So gone were the days where people are just throwing money at projects, right, without due diligence and so on and so forth. So I think it's an evolution. But having said that, it's just another label for fundraising. So that's how I see it. And going forward, obviously with STOs, there will be a lot more due diligence. You need to look at the background. You need to look at the financial stability of this company that is issuing the tokens and so on and so forth. So I think it is a step forward. It's an evolution in terms of fundraising. So I think it's good. And as was mentioned by the panelists earlier, this unlocked a lot of potential for companies out there, especially the small, medium enterprises. And from what I heard, the sweet spot is between 5 million to about 10 million. So that's the range that a lot of companies are looking at. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start with your earlier question about STO, right?
Yeah,
so I'm going to elaborate. I'd like to understand, you asked about how many know STO. So let's forget about the name. Mm-hmm. How many of you have invested in a property before? Right? A car? Have you ever buy a car? Have you ever invested in any asset at all before? Stock, bonds, right? STO, forget the name. It is investment of securities. Securities could be many forms. It could be an asset, it could be a property, it could be bonds, it could be a loan. So this is completely different from ICO. I kind of disagreed from one of the speakers yesterday saying that this is just peeling off the name of ICO and sticking STO in another name. It's a completely different animals, right? You cannot say food, there's all kind of food, but they are not the same, right? The Malaysian food, Chinese food, Indian food, you cannot say just food. It's very different, right? The main course, dessert. So STO coming back, it is a way for fundraising, but not the Wild West. It is the traditional investment opportunity that now being accelerated by the blockchain, right? So it's the next version of investment, but underneath, we have to look at it as a normal investment opportunity with putting on your traditional wisdom, right? Making an investment become an STO using the new way of fundraising doesn't make the investment opportunity itself more sexier, right? A remote village building in Africa doesn't worth more if it put the STO sticker for fundraising. It's still the same. But the power is liberation, right? When you think about now we all familiar with this video market, right? Because we all, some might be a victim, some might be a beneficiary, depends where you are in the ecosystem. About YouTube, right? You think about it. YouTube destroys so many media companies, especially local media companies, right? But why it can exist? Why it can have a video just playing a toy and become so successful? Because it got the audience on the global level, right? Before, a local media company, they can only serve the local community. This is same for fundraising, right? That's a good point for the Malaysia situation, right? If now, for the traditional fundraising, you might have a project trying to do fundraising locally, right? It might success, it might not, right? But if you take this project on a global scale, then there might be a lot more investor interest in this project. That's the power, right? So liberalization of capital on a global scale. So this is what we're looking at going into. Of course, there's still, it's very early stage. They still need a lot of regulation, and especially how do we regulate in a multi-jurisdiction environment, right? And not to just, this is just for the issuing part, and then later on, for example, we have an expert on the exchange. How do you deal with multi-country exchange or multi-listing? That kind of issue, of course, also need to be resolved.
Thank you, thank you.
I'm no expert on STOs, certainly won't claim to be, but yeah, we spend a fair amount of time looking more at the markets and the way that existing tokens are being traded. For us, when we look back on the space, this is our 5th year, and God knows how many cycles we've seen. So this is just another route, and for us, STOs present an interesting use case, undoubtedly, but I think you're just going to experience a lot of the early adopter teething and growing pains, so you just got to get used to that. I used to be a lawyer, so I guess I look at this with a fair bit of scrutiny, and I have a lot of doubts about some of the use cases I see coming up. That being said, it just means there's some very specific, defined, interesting ones. For example, the reassignment of rights for interest and debt across STOs, that sort of thing. I think it's just a pain to explain to people, and in reality, I think I can give better market color on what we see in the trading space, which is still very much alive, contrary to popular belief. For example, my firm alone in January, on a single token, which was USDC, we traded about $400 million of forwards. Like that's institutional size. That's happening with or without the growth of new venture being ICOs or STOs or any other thing. That's with stablecoins, with existing classified taxonomies in Bitcoin and Ether. And that's still very much happening. I would say that the difference now is a move away from retail and much more towards institutional players, maybe not in name or knowledge, but certainly in size. And it's more inter-desk dealing, which we're seeing these days. Which begs the question, with the regulatory points that have been raised here, when you do have STOs, if they're traded only on a whitelisted basis without a lot of the free P2P market exchange, it'll be quite hard for big institutional players to provide liquidity to that. And that's one of our concerns. So we're watching from the sidelines and very hopeful, but we'll see.
Just to pick up on Samson's point, it's all about, yes, sort of inclusion, sort of having, sort of this exciting new world. And when we talk about securities, digital securities, it's not just shares, it can also be bonds. So in an Islamic finance context, it can be sukuk. So already there's work being done by raising capital, interest-free capital, putting sukuks onto the blockchain. It could also be real estate. So there is an Islamic finance part of this, which was discussed yesterday, but it does need to have investor protection. So we do need to protect people's money, but we also need to raise capital. But just to sort of, just to include other asset classes, it's not just shares we're talking about, it's also bonds. So for example, last year in Australia with the World Bank, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and the World Bank raised $100 million for a World Bank initiative. It was called a Bondi, so it's named after the famous beach in Sydney. It's called a blockchain orientated new debt instrument. So it's not just about shares, it's also about bonds, sukuks, etc.
Okay. Well, I would say that thank you very much for the insight. So to give a little bit of perspective, I would have to agree with also Branson that ICOs, STOs is another name for crowdfunding. Basically, if you've got a project and you need to raise money, this is an alternative. Why? Because if you are from a startup scenario, no one's going to give you any credit line. Or have you tried borrowing money from the bank in your first 3 years? I was a banker. I wouldn't lend you even 10 cents. Why? Because you have no track record. Because you have no track record, you've got no credit history. That 10 cents that the bank lends out, right, there must be a way and justification to receive that money back, principal plus interest. But very often, after 3 years, statistics have shown that most projects die. Okay, so it's also the same with ICO projects. Okay, so ICO projects today, statistics from last year was about 1.7% is successful. So putting on your hat of your wisdom, common wisdom. Okay, when you go into a property. I'll give you another analogy. When you're finding your partner in life, you go through dating first, hopefully, and then maybe you do a bit of matchmaking, right? And then you find a criteria of what kind of partner you want. So basically, you need to go through that process, right? You will definitely ask your parents, you ask your friends, you can interact. I see some nods. So this is not a matchmaking thing, but STO is also effectively matching the investor and the project to get funding, right? So that's one scenario. Now, I also like to also draw the thing in phases. So there are phases pre-ICO and post-ICO. So a lot of people just raise money in the pre-ICO phase and then post-ICO, after raising like $10 million, $100 million, and then, oh, okay, I go for holiday. So that's when you're supposed to start work, basically, all right? So STOs. Now, STOs is also has its benefits, one of which is like making part of this building, for example, available to everybody on the street. So this empowerment is very, very important. This empowerment is no longer, I have to be a tycoon to buy out this whole building. You can strata it, but after strataing one unit, you can actually fractionalize it even further. So even with $100 or $200 or $1,000, you can actually take part. Of course, having said that, that's where we're trying to get into, because right now the stage that we are in is only at the 1% of the 100%. So we are so dynamic and so young. It's like .com in the 1995 and going into a burst, and then we have Amazon and then we have Yahoo, right? So give it a chance, but then do select your projects carefully, which brings me to the next question. How do you actually define a good project? Because here in front of me, right, are all the projects that have very successfully raised money will go on listing, and then you have Joshua from QCP who will actually do a bit of trading, in $400 million worth, But before you get to that stage, then we have Samsung make sure that he selects before he puts money down. I'm sure you guys will also do, right? So would you like to find out a little bit more what a quality project is? and what are some of the conditions that exchanges will look at before taking it on board. So we're trying to filter out the non-projects. Basically, people who are too creative, too dodgy, okay, which I'll come to a bit later. So anybody can fire it off. What is a good project, effectively? Or what do you see as a main criteria before you put your money down?
I'll try to give a view to start. So I think for seeking for funding or for investment, we also have to match what I call also the age. Just like you feed different kind of food to baby, to toddler, and to adult, okay? You have to match it. Whether your enterprise is a startup enterprise, right? Growth enterprise or mature enterprise. I still disagree with the comparison of ICO to STO because of this reason. ICO is about funding a vision. Is most likely being used. I still believe in ICO, by the way, okay? But I think it should be used as an angel funding. What happened last year, the problem of last year is all of a sudden everybody goes in to become a venture capitalist. They don't realize all their funding, the project, they're all startup project, right? People talk about scam of ICO. Not really. If you look at the startup project from the VC world, regardless of the method of fundraising, over 90% failure rate, right? So they're business failure and scam, but people lose money, they say, hey, you scam. It's not, sometimes it's business failure. So that's what I mean. ICO for the early stage, seed rounding kind of funding, right? And then if you go along the funding path, people will get VC money, Series A, Series B, and then, of course, eventually IPO. But we all know IPO is not so easy, right? For example, I come from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, the ICO requirement is 300 million profit, right? Which is a lot of money, right?
300 million profit.
Oh, sorry. $3 million US profit.
3 million.
Right? Profit. That's just the minimum requirement. But what about a company making $1 million profit? Is it a good company? It is a good company, right? So, but it's not easy to make to that stage. So a lot of problem is in between this company get raised a Series A, B, and until IPO. In between, this period is the most difficult for enterprise. If you are running an enterprise, you will understand. So you can see STO is kind of like, if you look at the US is the most mature in terms of all the financial market, fundraising, capital market. They actually have this thing called the OTC market, which does not exist in too many markets. But even in US, the OTC market is not very well because of the liquidity. But think of it that way, okay? So you're enterprise, you got your seed funding, angel one, whatever, or ICO, and then you go for traditional Series A, B to build your business a little bit, and then you can do a growth run through STO as a growth capital, right? So STO, when I'm investing in STO, is looking for project that need the money for the growth run, have some value. I'm funding a company with value, right? For ICO, I still invest in ICO. I will invest in ICO to fund a project with a vision that they're gonna build something that's gonna change tomorrow. That's the original story of ICO. It's just that all of a sudden, people become short-sighted, right? If you invest in ICO, you should invest in a company for 4 or 5 years down the road, not 6 months, right? You have to have that psychology. But for STO, it's about investing something with existing value, existing operation, to help the company grow, and eventually they IPO. I think that's my way of looking in investment.
Sure.
So,
yeah, go ahead, Brenton. Go ahead.
so I mean, just to follow up on Sam's point is that, so the ICO bit has been obviously, you know, the talk of the town, but I think the other angle of ICO is that if you look at it from the visionary point of view, obviously looking at the team and things like that, those we know, but the other part of it is actually understanding how much funds do they need to realize this vision, or how much runway do they need, right? So we have seen projects that raise hundreds of millions of dollars. We have seen $80 million ICOs and so on and so forth. Do you really need 80 million just to realize your vision? I think those are the duty that at the end of the day, we forgot to actually scrutinize, right? So if you tell me that, okay, this is a startup looking to raise some funds to realize this sort of POC, then I would say 12 months to 24 months runway is good. Then after that, how much is the operation cost for that 12 to 24 months? So those are the things. But I guess the exuberance of investing into a brand new revolutionary tech sort of got ahead of us, and then we just throw money at whatever projects that sound sexy. So it becomes like a bloated kind of a sort of a exercise, right? So 80 million, 100 million, there was a project that raised billions of dollars. I mean, this is incredible, I would say, yeah.
I mean, just to sort of go back a bit, look, we're looking to use the technology which the ICO market developed, sort of blockchain technology and empowering stock exchanges to be more efficient. But you have to remember, when we're talking about a security, it's regulated, right? So it's not up to the exchange to cherry pick a so-called project. I don't even talk about projects. You have a company who wants to issue capital. So if you want to issue capital, say on the Bursa Malaysia, you need to go to what is known as a member firm or a broker. You need to go to Kananga and get them to, on your behalf, raise capital at the Bursa Malaysia. Same with the Gibraltar Stock Exchange. We have member firms. Same with the Nasdaq. So unlike the ICO market, in my humble opinion, you can't just go to exchange and say, hey, I want to raise money. You need to go through what's known as intermediation. It's an intermediated model. So there's a company who wants to issue capital. They need to go to a broker. So if it's Goldman Sachs or if it's, Kananga or OCBC Securities in Singapore, you have to understand that there's a traditional market pathway to listing your security token. So in our view, it follows the existing world of raising capital via shares. You can't just come to us knocking on our door and say, give us 20 million bucks. Sure, others may suggest you can do that, but in our humble opinion, because it's a security, you need to be under a regulated framework. You need to fully adhere to KYC, know your client, anti-money laundering. We heard yesterday, from Might, how important these concepts are: investor protection, anti-money laundering, KYC. Even the Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir has stressed that Malaysia needs to get rid of corruption. So it needs to work under a regulated framework, which is an intermediated framework, and you need to involve intermediaries such as member firms who then on your behalf go to the exchange to raise capital. That is the pathway. But the exchange does not cherry pick, which so-called project or which company they list. That is the objective of the member firm to do that.
I'd raise one point that, as far as we can tell, it's still quite expensive to do an STO. I mean, at the point of all this is a crowdfunding mechanism. It's an efficient or a cheaper way to raise the money for a project you're trying to do. It's still pretty expensive to go through all the legal, hoops to raise money via an STO as opposed to going through traditional venture capital. And again, we're not mixing up the taxonomy or the classifications here. They're two very different things. But when you break it down, it comes down to cost. And so it's, again, an early adopter issue, and it is still quite costly, and hopefully that'll become cheaper over time. But that is still a blocker for a lot of people trying to do this.
So on the point of a broker or an advisor, so what would be the criteria to help a project or a company raise money? Because in the traditional stock exchange, basically you go into the public stock exchange and then you raise money through members of the public through ordinary shares. However, in the ICO or ICO method, effectively is the project or the company raises funds before going to the project, before going onto the exchange. So there's a slight difference here. What you're saying, Andrew, is that picking up on your point is that that we need to go through an intermediary, right? So how do we qualify that that company or that person is qualified to connect to the exchange? Because what we're trying to do is raise some of the points along that journey to weed out people who are not real people, or people that they claim that they are, right? Because when you say intermediary or you say broker, right, on the ground level, right, it's negative. I take it as a negative because right now with blockchain we can go direct, so it's sourced peer-to-peer. You know, you can go direct. So using an intermediary, there are also other challenges. You know, qualifications, experience, and then what criteria we need to look at. So that's starting to get a bit more complex. But maybe you want to shed some light, Andrew?
Look, I think Joshua makes a valid point. There is also a valid use for blockchain technology in the pre-IPO space. So crowdfunding using blockchain technology. So people such as Funnel in Singapore, example. So yes, you know, there is a valid case for there. And to answer your question, I think in the real world we have an example of Spotify where they raised capital before their listing. So they didn't actually. They still needed an intermediary to list on the NASDAQ exchange, but essentially they did all their fundraising and they simply went to the exchange to list and then to use what's known as a secondary market. So once the capital has been raised, you know, you don't just hold on to the money as you alluded to before and go on holiday. You know, you want people to start investing, and some people may want to sell some of their shares. So this is known as a secondary market, and this is where in the future liquidity providers, where QCP will come into space to make markets to help that liquidity. So there is a precedent in the traditional world of Spotify raising capital beforehand and then purely listing. The criteria which we look for our member firms to assist companies to list is that because we are regulated under Europe, under ESMA, we have to deal with member firms which themselves are regulated in their jurisdiction. So for example, in Singapore, they would need to have a CMS license to be regulated by the MAS. In Australia, they would need to have an AFSL license to be regulated by the Australian regulator, ASIC. So there is this regime which, you know, they would need to be regulated in their jurisdiction. But I am not saying that when you do a STO, you would have to issue a prospectus, because by definition, you know, in the US and in Singapore, you know, under the MAS guidelines, you have to issue a prospectus. I'm not saying it has to be a 400-page, you know, my friends at Morgan Stanley and my old shop UBS with 350 pages of disclosures. Essentially, it can be a white paper, but a more robust white paper. So I'm not saying it's got to be horrendous documentation. We're trying to get away from that and improve things. We actually do want to help people raise capital, but it's going to be, you know, slightly higher hurdle rates, because we are talking about regulation and we're talking about customer protection. We just cannot. Sure, there may be companies which raise capital and don't make it, but we just can't have scams. So we've got to separate, you know, the noise from the signal. So the noise is, you know, exchanges being hacked, people losing money, but the signal is, you know, JP Morgan issuing a coin, Mizuho Bank issuing a coin, the OECD coming out saying that capital raisings via STO is a valid way to raise money. We're seeing there's this whole discussion out there of custodianship. So once we raise capital, people like BlackRock, these big fund managers, Kazana, are they going to be happy with one of their traders holding a wallet? No, they're going to want to use something what's known as a custodian. So there's this whole theme of how do we institutionalize this market? So this is a whole other panel discussion, but these steps are slowly being made. So Fidelity, a big US fund managers, come in and said that they're going to be a custodian. So these are the signals to saying that this type of blockchain technology empowering existing stock exchanges to be more efficient is the way forward. So that is the signal you have to look at and discount all the noise.
I think one thing to add is it's clearly there's a lot of education to be done here, both in the market, even for investors. Even for the most sophisticated investors, it's hard to decipher the learning curve surrounding this space, whether it's ICO or STO, whatever the mechanism. If you think about it, you're forcing very unnatural liquidity on early stage venture capital where it shouldn't exist into highly inefficient markets. most people can't wrap their heads around that. Most accredited investors can't wrap their heads around that. And most institutional investors are not prepared for that. And that's led to a lot of the mishaps you've seen along the way. That's going to take a fair bit of time to overcome. And I think it's a little difficult to get past some of the regulatory hurdles without, a few good use cases coming into play, which is what most people talk about at conferences. But I think it's important to frame that up just because it's, again, I would frame this as like an early adopter issue. There are some of us in the room that understand how to deal with these issues, and there are some of us that don't. And there's going to be a lot of people that fall by the wayside, and it's very apparent to me who is still at these conferences and who isn't anymore.
Yeah, so just a quick one on the regulatory environment and things like that. So I think the Singapore government has responded to some of these changes, I think, fairly rapidly. So from the current regime of, one tier for the regulated market operator, RMO, so they have actually now expanded into 3 different tiers. So tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1, obviously, there's a cap as well. So 10,000 investors up to 20,000 each or something like that. So I think those are the steps forward that I think is needed. And even before that, I think what the Singapore MES did was that they also put out consultative papers, right? So they reach out to the associations and get feedback from the startups. So I think that's a step forward. So in fact, from the signal point, SGX also partnered with NASDAQ to actually embark on a blockchain experiment. It's called the Project Ubin. So Project Ubin phase 1, 2, and 3 that involves some of the banks, some of the financial institutions, and so on and so forth. In fact, you might have seen the Twitter put out in collaboration with NASDAQ. So I think all these things require the regulators to actually move forward in tandem with the technology. So just to quote the MES managing director, regulators' role at the end of the day is not to stifle innovation, but to sort of run 1 step or 1.5 steps behind technology so that the technology can flourish, but yet not too far back that you cannot, catch up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just add one more thing about perspective. I was at Uber in the early days, and come to think about this, it's been 10 years now since that company was founded, and I'm still sitting on a highly illiquid stock option there. But it's been 10 years, and you don't see me complaining about not being able to sell it. Obviously, hopefully, we'll have an IPO this year. It's just accepted market practice. You don't see as much hoo-ha as you might see in the ICO or STO markets about why isn't the token live, why isn't it listed, where can I trade it? This is 10 years, so just put that in perspective.
Right. Go
Well,
ahead.
my advice before we wrap up is I think most likely you are either like a potential issuer or a potential investor of STO in the future. At this point, is more meaningful to the issuer, right? Because they actually can have a new way to structure an issue to the professional investor, right? Because from the investor point of view, if you are professional investors, you actually have a lot of choice of different investment, right? People talk about fractional ownership. Maybe you can even buy the whole flat. Why do you need fractional ownership, right? But for the issuer side, I do see like immediately opportunity really to do an offering on a global level, right? This is about liberalization, as I mentioned before. Maybe there are, say, 1,000 professional investors here, but globally they can be 100,000, right? That kind of model that we can leverage on. So I think in the near term, it's probably more attractive to the issuer. But until there are more regulations coming up and lower the requirement of investment, because now it's actually illegal to sell STO into a non-professional investor, right? So they can participate in other ways, maybe for a fund. I'm sure there will be some STO fund coming up, can take a smaller LP, and then the fund can invest as a professional investor, but that probably the second stage. So I think that's the near-term situation that you will be facing.
Yeah. I think it's very important that as we see the numbers and the stakeholders, different stakeholders getting involved more and more from the last few years into moving forward. So if you're looking for examples, continue to research and educate yourself. That's my parting advice to you guys. So education is one. And because we are humans, we need to be creative. We need to keep innovating. So building is very important. So we continue to build. And then what we see is that we also need to seek advice from good authorities, okay? Get yourself involved in a community, right? Rather than just being yourself on your own, be in a community like this and then you start sharing. So the chances are you're leveraging off authorities with knowledge, and then you're also leveraging off what you guys as community, think what's good and what's no good. But before I end off, I'd like to ask the panel to give one advice, just one advice. I'm going to take a bit more minutes, okay? One advice to our members on the ground, okay? I did not take any questions from you guys, so my apologies. But one advice from where we're sitting, what and how can they better equip themselves for 2019 in the ICO space or STO space, yeah, or in the blockchain space? Yeah, just one advice. What do you think you give to everybody here?
Well, I say advice for issuer is think globally, right? It's a global game, but also a global competition, global opportunity, global competition. For investor, invest in what you understand.
Okay.
Rule of thumbs.
Rule of thumb. Okay, thank you. Andrew.
I think here in Malaysia, just keep an eye what the Securities Commission comes out with. They've come out this year with regarding ICOs, but just keep listening to what they come out with. Listen to what the Bursa Malaysia comes out with. Potentially, they could be coming out with some blockchain initiatives, and also the Bank Negara as well. So the Bursa Malaysia, the Securities Commission, and the Bank Negara, they are all heavily involved, or that they will be involved with security tokens within this regulated framework. But I think on the positive side, I think your new Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir, is very keen to sort of look at new technologies and how can Malaysia raise capital. Because he's already said to China, look, we don't need your One Belt, One Road, we'll rather do it ourselves. So how can you help Dr. Mahathir's vision raise capital for SMEs, empower, the people of Malaysia, but also at the same time do not rip off the investor?
Yeah, I'd echo that point. Just keep a close eye on regulations and try not to fall afoul of them.
I've got more than one word. So compliance, obviously. I think all the panelists have mentioned this. You have to comply with the existing regulations or regulations that will be will be put out regarding STOs. And the other thing is technology, right? I think that is the part also for those issuing tokens, right? At the end of the day, of course, you can just go to an issuer and then tell them that, please issue the STOs for me. But, what are the underlying technologies? Are you going to use Ethereum, which is ERC-1400, or are you going to use some other blockchain, right? So those are the things that you need to keep abreast with, because at the end of the day, that also makes a difference, right? So those are some of the things, yeah.
Okay. Well, my advice for you guys is get involved, invest only what you can afford, and be a participant, because you've got nothing to lose other than future-proofing yourself. So join a community, invest what you can afford, and you are only 1% of the 99% who haven't come on board. So it's still very early stage. And I give you numbers for that. We are talking about $130 billion. $130 billion, and the blockchain market is just 1% of the total market cap of our traditional stock exchange. In the last 2 years, 24 months, this space or this sector of blockchain has raised 1% of the total market space. So because of this exposure, you'll find that a lot of stakeholders will come in. From government, because it's new revenue for the government. If we raise 300 million, every month. Okay, every month. That's more than the tax that the casinos pay on an annual basis in Singapore per casino. If we do that every month, can you imagine if we have, So getting involved and this space is so dynamic that 1% of the total market cap is already being raised. So I think that is probably enough reason for you to actually get your eyes open and listen. Join the community. You have communities here in Malaysia, and then start talking and connecting with people. We are all open, and I believe that we should be behind and then take your questions a little bit more if you like. And
just talking about communities, I see my friend Rene here from Access Singapore, so
yes,
the man with the hand up, so
irony.
See him.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, and with that, I would say thank you everybody for being here and being in that 1%. I'll take one more question. Okay, sure, yeah, sure. So you got questions? Yes. Okay, everyone is shy, so we'll pass the mic around. Questions? Yes, sir. So maybe, sir, you can share with us your name and where you're from. Yeah.
Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
My name is Mohan. I'm a lawyer, local Malaysia, trying to be part of the community. Just taking up on one point of the STO, which Sam mentioned on the OTC market. What I would like to know is basically how many companies have actually issued STOs, and whether you see the STO space taking a route or perhaps momentum in the OTC market that you mentioned in SE in America, because we want to really see the proof cases of where this is likely to sort of grow, if you can assist.
Okay, well, there have been reports saying there's over 60 STO being issued globally, but we don't know the truth, right? Because many projects, as the speaker yesterday, they actually peel off the sticker of ICO and just call themselves STO. So we don't know how many are real STO, right? For real STO, they actually have to properly issue. In Hong Kong, for example, STO have to be issued from a regulated parties. The same kind of company that help people do financial advisory brokerage, so they're professional firms, and the lawyers, right? So they will do the STO. If you take off the name of STO, is actually securities. It's like a private placement, right? So the issuer actually have to do professional private placement memorandums, investor actually signing a subscription document, subscribing to something at the lawyers. So everything proper. So I don't know the numbers. But I think it is unproven yet, to be honest. We don't know. But we think it will take off because it's so popular, right? If the good projects goes in, someone will make money, and the media will spread the word, right? If you think about it, how ICO took off in 2017 is nobody talked about Ethereum ICO when they did the ICO, right? People only talk about ICO at the second half of the 2007 when they find out, hey, my friend make 5x, this guy 10x. Those are the words that spread. I think same for STO. When investor really making money, then the field will come in and the fire will get bigger.
So I just want to add on, I have some numbers, but of course I signed an NDA with this issuance, this company. What they said was that there were 82 STOs being issued, 82. Majority of it in North America, Canada, some in Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, and so on and so forth. But majority of it is actually issued under the regulation S and D, if I'm not wrong, in the US, and some of it under the Singapore. But again, regulation features heavily, obviously. And to Sam's point, it takes a lot of, you know the saying, right? It takes a village. But basically, it involves a lot of people. You talk about white paper, you talk about advisory work, you talk about, all these things. It takes a lot, yeah.
Just also to clarify, OTC. So OTC means over the counter. trading. So essentially, it's a bilateral trade. So you and a counterparty such as QCP engage to do a transaction. The other sort of type of market, which is the sort of the more traditional market, is a exchange traded market. So, for example, Bursa Malaysia derivatives. If I'm going to trade palm oil, I can go onto a screen, I can see a bid and an offer, and I can see so-called market depth, and I can see I can trade electronically on a screen. But the reason why the OTC markets are so prevalent is, imagine if I did an ICO and I have 10,000 Bitcoins, if I stick that onto, because there's so many different exchanges, so, factionalized and fractionalized, if I have 10,000 Bitcoin, I don't want to put 10,000 Bitcoin on the offer, I'm going to spook the market, so I need to go to a specialist like QCP to sort of help liquidate, say, my Ethereum, get my cash so I can get on with my project. So that's just the background why OTC markets are prevalent are prevalent in the ICO market, and probably will also be prevalent in the STO market when it starts off. So we will be relying on specialists such as QCP to not only do that liquidating trade when people raise capital, but also to provide liquidity. So this is known as liquidity provision. So this is prevalent particularly in the FX market, where you have Goldman Sachs, UBS, many different so-called liquidity providers, and you need to sort of aggregate all of these different providers, and then hence you need market makers to also come in to provide, do market making, which is providing a simultaneous bid and offer. So just to sort of clear up some of the nomenclature here.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? No? One more, sir? Okay. Get the ball rolling. Sorry, I can't really hear you there. Yeah.
Sorry.
Again.
Just on the point of cost, I think, Joshua, you were saying that for STOs, the cost is quite high. I mean, in terms of the normal cost for an IPO, what sort of multiples are we talking about? Is it 2 times, 3 times? If it comes to an STO, let's say, issuance.
You mean to do
Sure.
an STO?
I think it's apples and oranges, right? You're talking about an IPO, you're talking about a company that has 3 years of financials and a pretty significant balance sheet to back itself up. If we're talking an STO, we're talking about potentially SEO or ICO, a pretty early stage company that may not have that much capital to begin with. So it's more a proportion to how much balance sheet they have available. I can give you rough numbers. I mean, you go to a top rate STO lawyer specialist or ICO lawyer specialist in Singapore, ballpark, you're paying anywhere from 150 to 200 grand from sort of end-to-end structuring, opinion letter, offering docs, everything. US, yeah. And that's just the legal fees to begin with. Let's not even talk about marketing.
Yeah, that's your
so,
space.
so you break that down into how any early stage company looks at it. It's customer acquisition cost. So what's your CAC? Your CAC is going to be that divided by how many people you put in, how much money you raise from that. It's pretty high in proportion, so I wouldn't compare it to an IPO's cost.
Thanks.
Well, maybe I'll just answer that question. Basically, you can learn from the IPO. So if a company is going IPO, there'll be a lot of stakeholders, like what Branson was saying, that you need the whole village involved. So you got the underwriting bank, you got the legal, you got your advisors, So there's this whole bunch of people involved. So each one will have to have their own professional fees. So when you start to add them up, in Singapore, the legal fees for an IPO easily, just your share is 150,000. So you already know he's also the money guy, right? So that's for the lawyer. But if you're in a startup environment, you probably will not have that kind of money, right? Having said that, but then of course, once you're inside the legal profession, you have also the top tier that charge, Queen's Counsel, they charge much more. So there's also that tier. But on average, to do an IPO easily is what costs $1.52 million on total. I mean, of course, you could try to get it cheaper. Your friend give it to you earlier or cheaper or something like that. But that's about, and that's only in Singapore. I only can speak from Singapore perspective. Here, maybe I'm not sure. But I guess that would be the yardstick. That is probably one of the reasons why people use ICO versus going on to the IPO or STOs. So hopefully there's a blend in between.
I think, looking forward though, I think going back to the Spotify example, I think that did put a shudder through investment bankers, where Spotify raised capital and then just went to their, to their broker and said, look, I'm not going to pay you. I don't need your guys doing PowerPoints and checking the font of Spotify and going on a big elaborate, fundraising from San Francisco to Miami. All I want you to do is just list it on the exchange. So I would suggest that was a fraction of a typical IPO raise. I would also suggest that, look, sure, we have exchange fees, plus our members will also have their fees to do the STO, basically list capital on the Gibraltar Exchange, but it will be, I would suggest it will be competitive. And for example, we do see synergies when it comes to having like a template, sort of using the experience from ICO listings where we had white papers to have a more robust white paper, but nonetheless a prospectus. So, we don't need the 250 pages of a Morgan Stanley disclaimer. Let's bring some type of rationality back to the listing process. So I do expect costs to come down. But, to actually quantify it is going to be difficult. But I just say, look at what Spotify did and then sort of think about that type of disruption to raising capital for SMEs.
To give you a quick answer, for the practical case that we have seen is around $500,000. Okay, but if you use my example of the enterprise to position themselves as a growth fund, so it's after VC Series A or B, you're probably raising $10-20 million or even more. So that's the kind of cost analysis you should be looking at. I don't suggest you raise $5 million and do an STO. That should be an ICO.
Yeah.
Any more questions? All right, so I guess that's about it.
Okay.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.